December 7th, 1941, 7:57 in the morning. In 18 minutes, the United States Navy would suffer the most catastrophic attack on American soil in modern history. 188 aircraft, 2,403 Americans died, 8 battleships crippled or sunk. But in the middle of that hell, standing at a gun he was never trained to fire, on a ship that was already sinking, one man refused to stop. A man who, just hours before, had been collecting laundry. His name was Doris Miller. The Navy didn't even bother to write it down at first. They called him only an unidentified black messman. This is the story of how America forgot a hero and why it took a war, a nation, and decades of painful reckoning to finally remember him. To understand who Doris Miller was, you have to understand the world he was born into and understand just how hard it was to simply exist in it with dignity. October 12th, 1919. Doris Miller entered the world in Waco, Texas, the third son of Connery and Henrietta Miller, sharecroppers who worked land they would never own for wages that would never be enough. The family called him Dory. He grew up working the fields alongside his brothers, waking before dawn, learning the language of labor before he ever learned to read. There were no shortcuts in the Miller household. There were no illusions either. The Texas of Dory Miller's childhood was a place carved into two separate, unequal worlds. Jim Crow laws ruled every inch of daily life, separate schools, separate water fountains, separate futures. A black man in Waco did not grow up dreaming of becoming a soldier or a sailor. He dreamed most days about surviving, about making it to the weekend, about finding some small dignity inside a system that had been carefully engineered to deny him any. But Dory Miller was not a man who accepted the ceiling someone else had built above him. In high school, he played fullback on the football team, and those who watched him play said he ran like he was trying to escape something larger than the opposing defense. He was physical, he was focused, and by the time he was a teenager, it was clear to everyone who knew him that there was a force inside Dory Miller that the world around him was not built to contain. In 1939, at 19 years old, Dory Miller walked into a Navy recruiting office. He later told those close to him that he joined partly to see something beyond the cotton fields of Waco and partly to send money home to his family who needed it. What the Navy told him, what the law told him, was that a black man could not serve in a combat role. He could cook, he could clean, he could shine in the shoes of white officers, but he could not fight. So they gave him an apron and assigned him to the mess hall, and Dory Miller accepted it because there was no other choice. Not yet. Miller was assigned to the USS West Virginia, a Colorado-class battleship stationed at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. She was one of the most powerful ships in the Pacific Fleet. Her crew numbered close to 1,500 men. Dory Miller was one of the roughly 400 black sailors spread across the entire Pacific Fleet, and all of them locked into the same role: mess attendant, cook, servant, invisible by design. His days followed a rigid, grinding routine. He rose early, prepared meals, served them, cleaned up after, and did it all again. He was invisible to the Navy's official hierarchy, not a sailor in the combat sense, not a gunner, not a lookout. Just a face behind a food tray in the lower decks of a battleship. But the West Virginia's crew saw something in Dory Miller that the Navy's rulebook tried to ignore. On his off hours, Miller fought. Not out of anger, out of discipline. He trained hard in the ship's boxing ring, absorbed punishment better than almost anyone on the vessel, and by the time he was well established at Pearl Harbor, he had become West Virginia's heavyweight boxing champion. His crewmates, white and black alike, respected that. They called him a gentle giant off the canvas. Quiet, steady, unfailingly polite. The kind of man, they said, who made those around him feel somehow safer simply by being present. Nobody could have known just how true that would turn out to be. By the autumn of 1941, the mood at Pearl Harbor had grown tense beneath the surface. Naval intelligence reports warned of Japanese military aggression spreading across the Pacific. Senior officers debated strategies. Politicians negotiated terms. Ships were placed on alert and then stood down. The men of the West Virginia settled into the cautious rhythms of a base that felt, on most mornings, more like a harbor town than the front edge of a coming war. On the evening of December 6, 1941, Doris Miller finished his duties, spoke with his shipmates, and turned in for the night. He had no reason to believe the next morning would be anything other than another quiet Sunday at sea. 7:55 in the morning, the first wave of 183 Japanese aircraft crossed the northern coast of Oahu. Below them, Pearl Harbor sat perfectly still, ships moored in formation so tight and orderly that the attacking pilots later described it as a gift. They had never expected it to be this easy. At 7:57, the first torpedo struck the USS West Virginia, then a second, then a third. In the space of minutes, the ship absorbed 6 torpedo hits and 2 armor-piercing bomb strikes. She began to list immediately, tilting, flooding, groaning under the weight of seawater pouring through her torn hull. The men inside her felt the explosions as physical blows, aren't the kind that don't just shake a structure, but seem to shift the bones of everyone inside it. Doris Miller was in the lower decks when it happened. He had begun his morning rounds, collecting laundry from crew quarters, moving through the passageways he had come to know as well as any street back in Waco. When the first explosion hit, it threw him from his feet. The lights went out. Alarms started screaming. The ship lurched. Miller's assigned battle station, a magazine handling room for one of the anti-aircraft batteries, had been destroyed in the first wave of hits. There was no post for him to report to, no assigned role, no officer standing nearby to issue orders. He was a mess man on a sinking, burning battleship with no battle station, no weapon, and no training for the kind of combat unfolding above him. He could have stayed below. He could have pressed himself against a bulkhead and waited for orders that would never come. Many men did exactly that, not out of cowardice, but out of the paralysis that descends when the world you understood ceases to exist in the span of a single minute. Doris Miller went up. When Miller reached the deck and fought his way toward the bridge, he found West Virginia in full agony. Fires burned on the water around the ship, fuel oil ignited by the torpedo strikes, turning the harbor itself into something that looked like the surface of the sun. Japanese aircraft continued to circle and dive, their machine guns raking across every exposed surface. Men were running, shouting, falling. On the bridge, Captain Mervyn Bennion lay dying. A piece of shrapnel from an explosion aboard the neighboring USS Tennessee had torn into his abdomen with devastating force. He was conscious, still alert enough to issue commands, still present enough to understand what was happening to his ship, but he was losing blood at a rate that left no room for optimism. His officers worked frantically around him, trying simultaneously to save their captain and manage the destruction of their vessel. Miller moved to the captain's side. What happened next was captured in official testimony and corroborated by multiple eyewitnesses. Miller, a man whose entire naval career had been defined by servitude and deliberate limitation, took the mortally wounded commanding officer of one of America's most powerful battleships into his arms and attempted to move him to safety. This was not a written order, or there was no regulation demanding it. It was simply the act of a man who looked at another human being in agony and found that he could not walk away. He pulled, carried, and dragged the captain across the burning, listing deck, a man of extraordinary physical strength pouring every ounce of that strength toward the one thing that mattered to him in that moment. Captain Bennion, for his part, urged the men around him to save themselves. He told them, through gritted teeth, through the shock of his wound, that he did not want his men risking their lives on his account. Miller stayed anyway. He remained at the captain's side under active Japanese strafing runs until he was ordered away. Captain Mervyn Bennion died of his wounds that morning. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military recognition. The men who stayed beside him in his final minutes, Doris Miller among them, would carry the weight of what they witnessed for the rest of their lives. After being ordered away from the captain's position, Miller was directed by a lieutenant to assist in the operation of a .50 caliber Browning anti-aircraft machine gun near the ship's bridge. 2 officers were working the weapon. The air assault was intensifying. The West Virginia was tilting further with every passing minute, and the ammunition handling required every available pair of hands. And then, in the chaos and the noise and the fire, the moment arrived that would define Doris Miller's place in history. The officers at the gun were overwhelmed, wounded, occupied, momentarily unable to operate the weapon effectively. Miller had never been trained to use it. However, the United States Navy's own regulations had ensured that black sailors were not permitted to receive weapons training. They were not classified as combatants. The system had spent years making absolutely certain that Doris Miller would never be allowed near that gun. He stepped behind it anyway. He gripped the handles. He opened fire. Miller later recounted to Navy investigators that the weapon had felt instinctive in his hands, that he had simply taken aim and pulled the trigger, and the gun responded. He described watching Japanese aircraft diving low across the harbor and turning the gun to meet them, firing steadily through the smoke and the noise until the ammunition ran dry. He noted in the quiet understatement that seemed to be the defining quality of his character, that he believed he had hit at least one of the attacking planes. The aircraft, he observed, had been diving very close. How many planes he brought down remains a matter of historical debate. Some accounts credit him with 2 confirmed kills. Others suggest more. The exact number matters less than the fact that it happened at all, that a man who had been systematically denied the right to defend himself or anyone else stepped into that gap without hesitation and performed the role that the entire structure of the United States Navy had declared him unqualified to perform. He fired until there was nothing left to fire. And then, as the West Virginia continued to sink beneath him, as she settled deeper and deeper into the mud of Pearl Harbor with the weight of everything she had endured, Doris Miller was among the very last men to leave her deck. By the time the attack ended, 2,403 Americans were dead. The Pacific Fleet had been crippled in a single morning. Pearl Harbor, once a stretch of water so beautiful it seemed invented, now smelled of burning oil and scorched metal and profound, irreversible loss. Doris Miller had survived. He was eventually transferred to other vessels, continuing his assigned duties. The Navy had returned him to the galley. In the official after-action reports, in the initial accounts of heroism compiled by Navy officers in the weeks that followed the attack, Miller's extraordinary actions were recorded in a single clinical phrase, performed by an unidentified Negro messman. Not a name. Not a full accounting of what he had done. Not a human being deserving of recognition, just a category, a descriptor, an entry without a face. But the men who had stood on that burning deck knew exactly who he was, and soon so would the rest of the country. In the weeks following Pearl Harbor, Black America was paying extremely close attention. Across the country, in barber shops, in churches, around kitchen tables in cities and small towns, from Harlem to Los Angeles, people had heard the rumors that there was a black man at Pearl Harbor who had fought back, that he had manned a gun he was never supposed to touch and fired it at Japanese aircraft, that he had saved lives, that he had been a hero by any measure the word had ever meant. The Pittsburgh Courier, one of the most widely read African-American newspapers in the nation, began investigating immediately. Its reporters pursued leads through the Navy's layers of bureaucracy, pressed eyewitnesses for details, and demanded answers from an institution that was not accustomed to being questioned. The NAACP launched a parallel inquiry. The question at the center of both investigations was devastatingly simple. Who was this man, and why had America not been told his name? The Navy, under mounting public pressure it could no longer absorb quietly, eventually confirmed the identity of the sailor in question. His name was Doris Miller. He was 22 years old. He was a messman, and he had done something that the entire military establishment had declared, through its regulations and its racism, and its long institutional history of deliberate exclusion, to be impossible for a man like him to do. And the black press responded with the full force of its voice. The Pittsburgh Courier ran Miller's story across its front page and kept it there. Letters poured into the Navy Department from black communities in every part of the country, demanding that Miller be awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military distinction. Civil rights leaders wrote directly to the Secretary of the Navy. Telegrams arrived at the White House. The moral logic of the argument was airtight. If black men could die for America, they deserved to be recognized as heroes by America. The Navy declined. The reasons given were procedural and administrative, that the evidence did not meet the formal threshold required for the nation's highest award. Those who observed the process more closely believed the real reason was written in the same Jim Crow logic that had placed Doris Miller behind a food tray in the first place. The nation was not yet prepared to say, in its most solemn official ceremony, that a black man had been its greatest single hero on one of its darkest mornings. On May 27, 1942, 5 months after Pearl Harbor, as the Pacific War raged across thousands of miles of ocean, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, pinned the Navy Cross on the chest of Doris Miller aboard the USS Enterprise. The Navy Cross was the second highest honor the Navy could bestow upon a sailor. Nimitz described Miller's conduct as one of the most distinguished acts of valor in the history of the United States Navy. Miller stood at attention in his dress whites, his expression composed, his eyes directed forward. Those present at the ceremony said he accepted the medal with the same quiet dignity he had brought to every other moment in his life. He did not deliver a speech. He did not make demands. He simply stood there, the most decorated black man in the United States Navy, and let the moment mean what it meant, without theatrics, without performance, without anything other than the stillness of a man who had long since stopped needing the world to tell him what he was worth. The recognition, partial as it was, transformed him almost immediately into one of the most powerful symbols in American wartime culture. His face appeared on Navy recruiting posters. His story was broadcast on radio programs and reprinted in newspapers from coast to coast. The War Department understood, even if it would not fully act on the understanding, that Doris Miller's story was both morally compelling and strategically useful. In Black America, his significance ran deeper than any poster campaign. The Pittsburgh Courier had launched what it called the Double V campaign, a national movement built on a simple, devastating premise: victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. Two wars are being fought simultaneously, one on the battlefields of the Pacific, one in the streets, courtrooms, and military offices of the United States itself. Doris Miller became the campaign's most powerful living argument. Here was a man who had fought for a country that denied him the right to fight. He had risked his life for men who were permitted to serve in roles he was forbidden from holding. But he had done it better than almost anyone on that ship. The irony was not subtle, and it was not lost on anyone. A nation going to war against fascist ideology was running a segregated military. A man who had been barred from weapons training had become the most celebrated gunner of the war's opening day. America was leveraging Doris Miller's heroism to recruit new soldiers, while the system that had tried to prevent that heroism remained completely intact. Miller was aware of the contradiction. In interviews conducted during a war bonds tour in the months following Pearl Harbor, he spoke of his pride in his country and his hope that what he had done might help open doors for other black men who wanted to serve as full combatants, not as cooks, not as servants, but as soldiers. He expressed himself carefully and publicly with characteristic restraint, but those who knew him understood that the gap between what he had done and what America was willing to formally acknowledge wore on him. He had been celebrated and constrained in the same breath. That was perhaps the most American thing about his story. Despite his status as the most recognizable black face in the United States Navy, despite the poster campaigns and the Navy Cross, and the war bonds tours and the front page stories, Doris Miller was not reassigned to a safe posting. He was not brought home. He was not given a formal combat role, the thing he had essentially already performed under live fire in front of hundreds of witnesses. He was returned to active sea duty as a messman. In the fall of 1943, Miller was assigned to the USS Liscum Bay, a Casablanca-class escort carrier operating in the Central Pacific. The Liscum Bay was a smaller, faster vessel than the great battleships, designed to support amphibious operations by providing air cover for landing forces. She carried a crew of nearly 900 men. She was not built for the kind of punishment West Virginia had absorbed. She was not that kind of ship. By November 1943, the United States was pressing westward across the Pacific in a grinding island-by-island campaign. The Gilbert Islands were the next target. Tarawa, Mackinac Atoll, the sharp and bloody stepping stones toward Japan. The Liscum Bay was part of the Naval Task Force, providing air support for the ground operation. It was active duty in an active war zone. Dangerous work, but the routine kind of dangerous? Not the kind that sailors and soldiers learned to normalize because the alternative, fully absorbing the scale of the risk, makes the job impossible. November 24th, 1943, 5:23 in the morning. The USS Liscum Bay was maneuvering southwest of Butritari Island in the pre-dawn darkness of the Central Pacific. The sea was quiet. The sky was black. Somewhere beneath the surface of that water, the Japanese submarine W-175 had found her. A single torpedo struck the Liscum Bay near her stern. It hit the aircraft bomb storage magazine directly. The explosion was not merely catastrophic, it was instantaneous and total. Eyewitnesses on nearby ships reported that the Liscum Bay simply erupted, that the detonation of the bomb magazine sent a fireball into the pre-dawn sky so enormous it could be seen from miles away across the open ocean. Fire and debris rained down on surrounding vessels. The ship that had been there a moment before was already gone in any meaningful sense. The Liscum Bay sank in 23 minutes. Less time than it takes to eat a meal, less time than it takes to write a letter home to a mother in Texas. 644 men died that morning. Nearly 3/4 of her crew, among the dead listed in the official records as missing in action because the Pacific had taken everything and given nothing back, was mess attendant first class Doris Miller. He was 24 years old. His body was never recovered. The ocean kept him, the way it keeps so many of the men who fought and died in its waters. Without marker, without grave, and without a place where the people who loved him could go to stand and remember and say his name into the open air. Back in Waco, Texas, Connery and Henrietta Miller received the telegram that no parent should ever have to read. Their son, the boy who had run through cotton fields and trained in a ship's boxing ring and fired a gun that a nation full of rules had tried to keep from his hands, was gone. He had not even lived long enough to see whether any of it would change anything. The United States Navy named a frigate after Doris Miller in 1973, 30 years after his death. It was a late acknowledgement that the man they had once listed in an official report as only an unidentified Negro messman deserved to have his name on a ship. But that was not the end of the reckoning, not even close. In 2020, when Congress authorized the construction of a Gerald R. Ford-class aircraft carrier, the most powerful class of warship ever built by the United States Navy, and gave it the name USS Doris Miller. Not a frigate, not a destroyer, a supercarrier. 100,000 tons of steel and firepower, bearing the name of a man who had once been told in every language the law knew how to speak, that men who looked like him could not be trusted with a weapon. Memorials have been erected in Waco. Schools carry his name. His portrait hangs in naval facilities. The Medal of Honor, the decoration that was denied him in 1942, has been formally requested for Miller multiple times by lawmakers and advocacy groups who argue, with evidence that is difficult to dispute, that the original denial was an act of racial discrimination masquerading as administrative procedure. That campaign continues today. Doris Miller was born into a country that had already decided what he was worth. The Navy handed him a ladle and told him that was the full shape of his service. The law made certain that the guns on the deck of his own ship were not his to touch. The system had done everything in its power to ensure that on the morning of December 7th, 1941, Dory Miller would remain invisible, would simply disappear into the smoke and the fire and the silence of history, unremarked and unnamed. He did not disappear. He went up on that deck. He carried his dying captain across a burning ship. He took hold of a weapon that his country had spent years trying to keep from his hands, and he used it to defend men who, in the eyes of every law that governed his service, were considered more valuable than he was. And when the ammunition was gone, and the ship was sinking, and the smoke was so thick it had become its own kind of darkness, Dory Miller was among the last ones off. There is a question that history keeps asking about men like Dory Miller. It asks, what made him do it? What made him run toward the fire instead of away from it? What made him stay at the captain's side when everything said leave? What made him grip that gun? The answer, in the end, may be simpler than the question deserves. He did it because it needed to be done, because someone had to, because in the morning the world changed, Doris Miller looked at the chaos surrounding him and decided, in the space of a heartbeat, without training, without orders, without so much as his name written down in an official report, that he was not going to be a bystander to history. His name was Doris Miller. The world called him Dory. The Navy called him a messman. His country called him a hero. Eventually, haltingly, incompletely, and decades too late. He called himself a sailor. He was 24 years old. Doris Miller was nominated for the Medal of Honor in 1942. He was denied it, not because his actions fell short of the standard, but because the country he fought for was not ready to say, in its highest official ceremony, that a black man had been its greatest hero. That conversation is not finished. 80 years later, the Medal of Honor that Dory Miller earned on December 7, 1941, has still not been placed in his family's hands. Organizations, historians, and members of Congress continue to push for the recognition that was withheld the first time. Learn his story, share it, make sure his name is never forgotten again. Search his name, sign the petition, tell someone who doesn't know who he is. Because the only thing worse than what was done to Dory Miller is allowing it to happen in silence.